Aediles marked the second rung on Rome's cursus honorum. Though they were unusual in one important way, the office was entirely optional. An ambitious politician could skip the aedileship altogether and advance directly from quaestor to praetor, but doing so often meant enduring a long gap, sometimes as much as 9 years, between offices. Aspiring leaders of Rome needed ways to strengthen their political resumes, and this is where the aedileship proved valuable. We've already discussed quaestors, who typically served as subordinates to more powerful officials. Aediles, by contrast, operated with far greater independence. Holding the office of aedile offered an excellent opportunity to build a public reputation. It could never be a required stage in a political career, simply because only 4 aediles were elected each year. Even so, the role was especially attractive to populist politicians, as its duties involved constant, direct interaction with Rome's lower classes in everyday urban life. Hold on, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before talking about why the office mattered, we should first ask a simpler question. What did aediles actually do? Many people imagine them as elected religious officials, but that picture is far from accurate. Religious duties in Rome belonged to the pontiffs, who were entirely separate and operated independently. Aediles were something quite different. The term aedile literally means temple builder, which offers a clue to the office's origins. Over time, however, the role expanded well beyond that narrow definition. Broadly speaking, aediles were responsible for managing public life within the city of Rome. Of course, that description is so vague it's almost useless, so let's be more precise. Despite the meaning of their title, aediles were no longer expected to build temples. By this point, any private individual could sponsor the construction of a temple. Instead, the aediles' responsibilities evolved into something far more practical and wide-ranging. Private citizens, the Roman Senate, anyone could commission a temple. Once it was built, however, responsibility for its care fell to the aediles. And that raises an obvious question. What did upkeep actually mean? At first glance, temple maintenance hardly sounds like a position people would compete fiercely to obtain. But in Rome, it was far more significant than it appears. Take the Temple of Saturn, for example. It served as Rome's treasury. The Temple of Castor and Pollux functioned as the Senate's meeting place. Ancient Rome didn't really have government buildings in the modern sense. Temples filled that role. Managing them meant overseeing the physical spaces where the state itself operated. And the aediles' responsibilities didn't stop with temples. They were also in charge of the public baths, vast, sophisticated complexes open to everyone. These were monumental feats of engineering and social life, and there is no true modern equivalent. For most Roman citizens, unless they were extremely poor, a visit to the baths was part of the daily routine, usually in the middle of the day. These complexes were central to Roman social life, and over time they expanded far beyond simple bathing facilities. They included rooms for weightlifting and wrestling, areas for dice and board games, libraries, restaurants, shops, almost everything you can imagine. Managing the public baths alone could have been a full-time occupation. A constant supply of fresh water was essential for keeping these bathhouses running, which meant the aediles were also responsible for maintaining the aqueducts. Remarkable feats of engineering in their own right. Their oversight didn't stop with water. They were also tasked with managing the city's food supply. Cheap or even free bread was distributed through state programs, and it was the aediles who ensured this system function. That meant securing reliable grain supplies, storing them in public warehouses, and stockpiling enough to carry the city through the winter months. I won't belabor the point, but by now the picture should be clear. Most of the everyday functions we would associate with a modern municipal government fell under the authority of the aediles. For the men actually serving in these offices, everything I've just described probably occupied only about 40% of their attention. In reality, their main focus lay elsewhere. Aediles were responsible for organizing public festivals and holidays, and this, more than anything, was the true attraction of the office. It's also the reason they've earned a somewhat misleading reputation as religious officials. The state did provide a modest annual budget for staging these festivals. But over time, it became customary for aediles to supplement public funds with their own private wealth. Julius Caesar is the most famous example. He borrowed and spent several fortunes simply to secure election to the office. Once elected, He borrowed and spent several more fortunes to host some of the most extravagant games Rome had ever seen. Caesar was intensely ambitious and determined to make his name impossible to ignore. And to see just how far he was willing to go, let me give you one example of the controversy he deliberately stirred up during his time as Aedile. This part needs a bit of context, but I promise it's worth the detour. When Julius Caesar was still a teenager, Rome was torn apart by a civil war between two powerful figures, Sulla and Marius. Sulla was an aristocratic conservative who claimed to be fighting to restore the authority of the Senate and the traditional privileges of the upper classes. Marius, by contrast, was a low-born populist who championed the power of the popular assemblies and presented himself as a defender of the common people. At least that's how each man justified his actions. In reality, both were openly ambitious, and by the war's end, they had crossed an unthinkable line. Each, at different times, marched on the city of Rome at the head of an army, something that had previously been taboo in Roman political life. The conflict ultimately ended in victory for Sulla and the conservative faction, but it left Rome deeply scarred and traumatized. And here's the crucial detail I've held back. Marius was Julius Caesar's uncle by marriage. When Sulla captured Rome for the final time, the city descended into chaos. Death lists were published, old scores were settled, and violence filled the streets. Because of his family ties, Caesar sought nearly all of his property confiscated, and fearing for his life, he was forced to flee Rome for several years. Fast forward to the moment when Caesar had nearly bankrupted himself to secure election as Aedile. What did he do with this new authority? Recall that Aediles were effectively responsible for Rome's public buildings and temples. Using that power, Caesar quietly issued orders for the honors, trophies, and commemorative tributes to his uncle Marius to be restored throughout the city. The work was carried out under cover of darkness, without public notice. When Romans awoke the next morning and saw monuments and temples once again bearing tributes to Marius, outrage erupted. Or rather, outrage erupted in the Senate. One senator famously accused Caesar of assaulting the Republic with a battering ram. But the people loved it. Marius had been one of them, and the years under Sulla had been harsh enough that many Romans were ready to romanticize the defeated populist. Public opinion swung quickly in Caesar's favor. Almost overnight, Caesar transformed himself into a political brand. He openly embraced the populist mantle of his uncle and even purchased a home on the Aventine Hill in one of the city's poorer districts, deliberately distancing himself from the traditional senatorial neighborhoods. Determined to make an even bigger impression, Caesar turned his attention to the great Roman games held each September. He borrowed and spent far beyond what was customary, staging enormous public feasts, exotic animal hunts, and lavish gladiatorial contests. These spectacles, in particular, stirred controversy. According to contemporary reports, Caesar imported vast numbers of gladiators from across the Roman world, equipping them with silvered armor and the finest weapons money could buy. The Senate was genuinely alarmed. After the Marius episode, they feared he was assembling a private army and preparing to overthrow the government. The Senate even went so far as to pass a law limiting any individual to no more than 300 gladiators within the city at one time. Our sources note that Caesar had 320. Either someone miscounted or Caesar was deliberately stepping just over the line to rub the Senate's nose in it. During his turbulent year as Aedile, Caesar technically shared both the responsibilities and the expenses of the office with his fellow Aedile, Bibulus. In practice, the games were presented as a joint effort. Bibulus himself offered a wry comment on the situation. As I mentioned earlier, the Senate officially met in the temple of Castor and Pollux, the so-called divine twins. But as often happens, everyday speech shortened the name to simply the Temple of Castor. Bibulus joked that the shared aedileship of Caesar and Bibulus followed the same pattern. Like the Temple of Castor and Pollux, it was known only by one name, the aedileship of Caesar. In other words, Bibulus was keenly aware that Caesar was getting all the credit. Bibulus came to see Caesar as an egoist, and over time he developed a deep and lasting resentment toward him. This won't be the last time Bibulus appears in our story. He will go on to play a significant role in Caesar's life later on. I'll continue tracking his career in the videos ahead. I'll end with this comparison. You may remember from the quaestor episode how exemplary Cicero was during his service in Sicily. He treated the landowners fairly in negotiating grain shipments, and in return secured a steady and affordable supply for Rome. During his own term as Aedile, however, Cicero simply couldn't afford to spend on anything like the scale Caesar did, or even on the scale expected of many Aediles. He was a newly minted aristocrat from an undistinguished provincial family, elevated almost entirely by personal talent. He had no great family fortune and no network of political favors to draw upon. Fortunately, his new clients and allies in Sicily noticed what was happening and stepped in to support him. During the major festivals in Cicero's year as Aedile, the Sicilian associates generously sent an abundance of free food to Rome for the public. People described Cicero's festivals as refined and restrained, which, to be honest, wasn't exactly praise, but they generally overlooked this because of the lavish feasts he provided at no cost to the poor. In the end, the political connections he had built during his time as quaestor pulled him back from the brink, and his aedileship was largely viewed as successful.